All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm here with Dr. Linda Jones. Thank you so much for joining us today for this very special IOSCIRS panel. I want to just very quickly, we're going to get a couple of minutes. We'll bring in all of our panelists, but I wanted to express my own on behalf of myself and all of the rest of the IOSCIRS committee. Particularly the planning committee for this event. Many, many thank yous to our panelists who are donating their time today and their expertise. And I also want to give a rather big thank you to Dr. Linda Jones, who is directly below me, for all of her effort in getting this all pulled together. And so thank you, thank you. So welcome to our first ever special programming IOSCIRS panel on science communication and engagement. So I'm going to let Linda do all of the real introductions. So just a quick logistical couple of things. As you might know, here on the broadcasting side, we're about 30 seconds behind what's going on YouTube. So I encourage you to have dynamic discussion in the chat as we go today. Type your questions as they come, because if you wait until we're at question and answer time, they get to us on a lag. So just keep the chat going, and we're monitoring it, and we'll be including it towards the end of the hour. So about 10 minutes to the end of the hour is when we're hoping to start the sort of audience Q&A. We have asked, and our panelists have graciously agreed, that if the chat is really popping off, we can hang out for a couple of minutes extra. So be warned that we might hang out and take a little bit extra time. And I think that's everything from my end. So I'm going to pass it on to Linda. And thank you again, everyone. Looking forward to a really productive conversation.
So thanks, Bethany. So I want to reiterate Bethany's appreciation for the speakers taking their time today, and also to IOSCIRS, to Bethany and Sabaya and Warren, who conceptualized this seminar. And I am serving simply as the moderator. This was really their conceptual idea, and they put it together. So thank you very much. This session is different from other IOSCIRS sessions, if you've participated in IOSCIRS before, in that this is a very interactive session with panelists. So there are a few slides up front, and then we move into panel discussion. We haven't done this before, so we hope it works really well on this platform. We think it will. But it's different than what we've done, and we're all really excited about it. So thanks to everyone for helping get this together. So we want to start with some introductions from our panel members. So I wanted to start, I see everyone's coming up. I wanted to start with David Van Wagener, and everyone's going to give a brief introduction about themselves. So David, take it away.
Sure. My name is David. I'm, as my little label there says, I'm a quadriplegic. I've had a spinal cord injury for about 18 years. I am not a researcher. I'm not really involved with engagement so much. Early on, after my injury, my family was involved with some fundraising for research, but none of us are really experts or engage a lot. I myself am a chemical engineer, so I do have some science background. I enjoy learning about the science, but I don't have really the channels for learning those things. I learned some things through the news, which can be a little deceptive at times and not fully not the best place to learn about spinal cord injury research. So that's a little bit about me. I'm interested in learning more at all times, but always interested in finding out what those methods might be.
Thank you, David. Jen.
Hi, I'm Jen French. I too am living with a spinal cord injury, a C6, C7, for 23 years now. But I also have a couple of other hats that I wear. So my day job is I'm the executive director of Neurotech Network. We're a nonprofit that focuses on education and advocacy of neurotechnology devices, therapies, and treatments. That's the nonprofit side. The for-profit side is market intelligence and neurotechnology industry. We run a couple of investment meetings per year, but also related to spinal cord injury. I'm the vice president of the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium, which is really trying to pull together all of the people living with spinal cord injury, the nonprofit organizations that represent them, and all of our partners and stakeholders and researchers like yourselves and institutions to all really have a common voice and try to move spinal cord injury research and care and policy forward.
Thank you, Jen. Gordon.
Hi, I'm Gordon Mitchell. I'm a professor at the University of Florida. I suspect that I'm on this call because I've been investigating fundamental science for many decades, and we've been able to translate that now far enough along that we have 4 ongoing clinical trials working with some great clinical colleagues. The approach we're taking is the ability of intermittent exposure to low oxygen to elicit plasticity in respiratory motor systems, and it turns out other motor systems, and that was a surprise along the way. We came to realize that that had some potential to treat not only spinal cord injury, restore motor function, but other disorders that undermine the ability to move, such as ALS. So in one way, it's a double translation. We've gone from very fundamental science into human trials, at least, and then translating laterally, looking at different motor systems from breathing, arm function, leg function. And those are now in clinical trials, as I mentioned, with some great colleagues like Emily Fox here at the University of Florida, working on breathing improvements, with Zev Reimer and Milak Sandhu in Chicago at the Shirley Ryan, working on arm function, and Randy Trumbauer at Spalding and Harvard, working on leg strength and walking. Basically, we've now gone back to a translational flywheel, that's what I would call it, where with those trials ongoing, we've recognized other things we need to sort out, how to optimize the treatment, biomarkers for who it's going to help the most, device design. I mean, this is going to require that we have devices that are potentially usable in the home, and combinatorial therapies that will enhance things, whether it's task-specific training with the intermittent hypoxia or drugs that might enhance its effects by removing things that undermine the efficacy or that can actually synergize and enhance the efficacy from other perspectives. So with that, I'll turn it over. Thanks.
Thank you, Gordon. Murray.
Hey everyone, I'm Murray Blackmore. I'm an associate professor at Marquette University. I'm a basic researcher. I work in animals. I take a gene therapy approach to trying to get axons to regenerate better. I think like a lot of basic researchers, I hope to make work that will ultimately translate to humans someday. I also think like a lot of preclinical researchers, I don't know everything that I need to do that in the most effective way. So always keep that in mind. I have another identity as well. I'm sort of here as a family member. So my mom got a high cervical injury when I was an adolescent. So I kind of grew up with that. She lived for 26 years in the chair, and then she died in the chair, right? So I toggle, right? I'm an interested, invested scientist who's built that career. But I also am sort of a frustrated and dissatisfied consumer, if you will, who's sort of very open to arguments that maybe the system isn't working as well as it could, and maybe there's things that we should do to make it go faster. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Murray. Vivian.
Thank you, Linda. And I'd like to add my special thanks to Bethany Condilas and the organizing committee for putting this special session on. It's really a great pleasure to be part of it. So as many of you know, my name is Vivian Mushahwar. I'm a professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of Alberta in the city of Edmonton in Canada. I'm also the director of the SMART network, and SMART stands for Sensory Motor Adaptive Rehabilitation Technology. We are a network of more than 250 people from many different disciplines, including researchers in the biomedical and health sciences, engineers and clinicians, and collectively, we're focused on developing interventions that significantly improve functional outcomes, life experiences for persons with neurological conditions. And of course, our ultimate goal is to take these innovations to the clinic where they can improve quality of care and improve patient outcomes while also reducing healthcare costs. Now, in my lab, we focus primarily on spinal cord injury and have been developing ways that can improve mobility and reduce secondary complications. In terms of mobility, we have focused much of our attention to date on restoring standing and walking. As for secondary complications, our focus has been on preventing pressure injuries and deep vein thrombosis and reducing spasticity. In our work, we combine knowledge from neuroscience, biomedical engineering, and rehabilitation, and focus on reactivating the nervous system, particularly spinal cord, through innovative uses of electrical stimulation and neuromodulation. And the outcome of our work so far has been intelligent wearable or implantable electrical stimulation devices, as well as new therapeutic paradigms for enhancing neurorecovery after injury. Now, in terms of models that we use in our research, we actually use quite a few preclinical models, including rats, cats, pigs, and non-human primates. We also recruit persons experiencing spinal cord injury to participate in our research projects. And we commonly engage with the end users of our innovations in identifying what these innovations should look like and how they should work, because we want them to be accepted and adopted after we finish working on them. With that, I'll just stop here and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Vivian. So before we start our panel discussion, we just have a few sort of background slides that we're going to start with. So thank you to everyone for your introductions. And if I can advance my slides, that will be advantageous. Okay, so as noted, this is an IOSCIRS sponsored workshop, and it didn't work. So what you're supposed to see, there we go. So it's IOSCIRS birthday. The first IOSCIRS seminar was the 1st of April, 2021. So it's very close to our birthday. And this seminar, in part, the idea for this seminar was generated as a result of that. So looking at the goals and definitions for this session, there are two main things that we want to focus on today. One is communication and how we communicate in a language that meets everyone's needs. The second thing that we want to focus on is engagement. How do we engage with individuals with spinal cord injury along the research spectrum, particularly with the IOSCIRS group focusing on engagement at the preclinical level. So what we really want to come away with after this seminar today is what can IOSCIRS do to foster communication and engagement, again, specifically mentioning at the preclinical level, with researchers and individuals living with spinal cord injury beyond this April 6th seminar? And is there a roadmap that we can consider, that we can look at building as to how we do this? Now, others have thought about some of these questions. So this is a survey that the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium conducted in preparation for SCI 2020. And so there are two things I'm going to focus on here. The first is communication, which you talked about. And one of the questions was, do you feel you need to increase your knowledge or have a better understanding of the research or research process? And the people that were surveyed were individuals living with spinal cord injury, and 77% indicated, yes, they need to increase their knowledge and wish to increase their knowledge. And additionally, they were tired of the media hype about research results that are not yet available for treatments. 83% felt that way. So a few questions that focused on engagement. Do individuals living with spinal cord injury want to be involved in the setting of research priorities? Well, 91% said yes. And do they want to be involved in designing projects? 78% agreed. And do they feel left out of the research process until researchers are looking for participants? 83% agreed with that. So there has been work done by others about engagement across the clinical trial spectrum, and don't try and focus on the text in this slide, because my point is really that there have been, people have looked at how to engage across the full spectrum from pre-discovery all the way to FDA approval and beyond. But our focus today is really on this early phase of preclinical work. And to that end, so we want to talk about discovery through preclinical, and that's really reflected in our panel, although some of our panelists also have clinical experience. But we need to define what we mean by preclinical. And for the purpose of this discussion today, will define the scope as anything preceding work in humans, because I think it's maybe less intuitive how one might engage and communicate at this level. And so this is extracted from the graphic that I showed previously, but at that discovery phase, the bullet points are developing research questions of interest to the community, providing data on the unmet need and therapeutic burden coming from the community, funding and fundraising, and understanding of the mechanisms of action relevant to disease and symptom burden. So these are things that have been suggested as ways to engage at the preclinical level. And on the NASCIC website, there are points of engagement in the research process. And I highlighted the top 2 here that I think may be most relevant to preclinical work, but we'll hear more from the panelists on this. And this is collaborating to develop and define and refine a question that matters, as well as involvement in the grant application and review process. But as I read these things, I'm still left with questions. And I think, were I to give advice to someone on how they might engage at the level of preclinical research, I don't have great examples. And in fact, recently was involved in an effort where I really felt like, gosh, I really don't know how to do this. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion with our panel as far as concrete ways that we can really engage and also communicate, going back to that primary focus. So the final slide is resources. These slides are going to be posted on the website, so you don't need to spend any time looking at this slide because all these resources will be publicly available. So I'd like to close the slides down now and really focus on our panel. And we have some questions that we want to pose to the panel. And again, around the issues of communication and engagement. So the first questions are towards the researchers on our panel, but I would encourage any panel members to respond and jump in. So the first question has to do with communication and asking our researchers, have you had any formal training in science communication or outreach? And if so, was it helpful? And how does it impact your daily work? So let's start with Vivian.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. I can't think of having formal training in science communication, but I have attended seminars on the topic, and I have attended mini workshops on the topic, but not kind of formal in terms of certificates and what have you in the matter. But I think beyond that, the most critical thing for me and for my lab and why people join my lab is because we want to take interventions out of the lab and we want to be able to make a difference. So we've been quite open in our communications and in soliciting feedback from the intended end users. And for, in our case, it's persons experiencing spinal cord injury and their caregivers, and as well as the clinical staff that provide the care to persons with spinal cord injury. And we found this, so basically we just came up with our own mechanism, and that is that we have information sessions. And in those information sessions, we have facilitators who really have no vested interest in the research, let's put it that way. So the researchers go in and give a brief introduction about the innovation and the science behind it and where it is, and then we leave. And the facilitator's job is to understand from the attendees whether they care about the problem that we're dealing with, whether they are interested in those initial prototypes that we may have envisioned would take place, and then how would they like us to proceed? What should the intervention look like? How should it work? And I must say that these information sessions probably were the most critical in many of our innovations, because we would have just gone on developing things in one way that we thought was the best way, only to find out that people just hate the end product. And one example is Smarty Pants, which we developed for preventing pressure injuries. When we had an information session, users hated the color, the fabric, the design, the whole 9 yards, but they loved the concept, and they learned new things about pressure injuries. But in the end, Smarty Pants now looks like what people wanted it to be. And otherwise, we would have just gone on on a path that's not going to get us anywhere. We did the same thing for implantable interventions to restore standing and walking, and try to understand from the intended end users what they would like these innovations to be like. And we're guided by that moving forward. So, so we've done these sessions that are very critical. We do not have people embedded in the lab experiencing spinal cord injury. It's not a bad idea. But from our interactions with people experiencing spinal cord injury, they want to come in at the proof of concept stage and want to be engaged from that point on. So that's what we've been doing ourselves.
Thank you, Vivian. So you've actually addressed both communication and engagement. So thank you for, no, that's great, because that's also, there are two separate questions here. So thank you. Gordon, would you like to talk about whether or not you've had any formal training in science communication, and how did it impact your work or not?
Well, to answer the question as directly as I can, no, I think I never have. But in terms of communication, I mean, so much comes through experience. It's not so different from what Vivian has described, although our lab is much more basic. We're not trying to deliver a product. We're really looking at mechanisms of plasticity. And what I learned the most from, to be quite honest, was when I began teaching many years ago. And actually, my first lectures were in evolutionary biology, so something very different. But you just learn how to talk to a group of students that doesn't really know what they're doing, and how to bring them along. And then you realize that as you write grants, it's also about storytelling, and you need to be very careful how you say it. And the more dense you make it, because it makes you feel somehow superior as a scientist, the less likely it is to succeed. And that's very true with grantsmanship. And I've sort of found then, as a chair of department, also getting involved a little bit in even fundraising and things, the way you have to tell stories when you're talking to a group of alumni or something like that. It's really about storytelling. That's a commonality. And that requires that you not use a lot of jargon. Acronyms should be gone. Jargon should be at least thought about if you're going to use it, and define very carefully and use very few. So those rules are just things that I think I picked up along the way, but it isn't to say I couldn't be improved with a little formal education. But the gray hair says, yeah, we didn't have that kind of thing back then.
So Murray, have you had any formal training in science communication or outreach, and how has that impacted your work?
No, I've never had anything like that. Gordon's right. Teaching does help a bit, but mostly it's just trial and error, and you learn what works and what doesn't. For what it's worth, I'm not sure it's the most, I don't think it's the largest barrier. I don't think that the most important thing is to figure out, how do we make our slides or use the right words so that people understand us better. I think the real conversation is more on the engagement side, and I'm going to call it relationship building. I think what you need is an ongoing two-way relationship with the SCI community. And a lot of the communication kind of works its way out in the course of that relationship. So that's what I would say.
Okay. So I just want to ask a really quick follow-on question. And if you can just briefly address this, because we want to move on to our questions about engagement and our questions for our other panelists. But in your labs, Vivian, Gordon, and Murray, do you provide, I would say, emphasize communication, lay communication with your trainees?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have a very diverse group of scientists and researchers and learners. And even within the science community, you have to be very careful about how you communicate, because people don't understand what you're talking about unless they are directly in your field. So they are trained to speak to a diverse audience all the time. We have a lot of visitors who come to the Smart Network, from policymakers to end users to to CEOs of companies and what have you. So the students are really always exposed to environments where they have to be able to communicate in a very approachable way, and really stay away from the jargon that no one is going to understand unless you're in 2-3 labs that happen to work together. So I guess what I'm saying is the nature of the work that we do, the Smart Network allows people to, or forces people to be able to communicate quite to a diverse audience.
Great. And Gordon and Murray, can you just, let's go with Gordon first, briefly comment on whether or not it's an emphasis for you on trainees, and you can, just yes, no.
I can't say it's fully an emphasis for outreach in that sense, although some students seek that, and so we surely encourage that. But in a P32 training grant from NIH that we have, one of the things that we have built into it is sort of learning the language. If you're a basic scientist doing preclinical work, understanding what is said in the clinic, and vice versa. If you're clinically qualified, learning the basic studies and things like that. And, it comes at many different levels. But as I said, I believe it's the same skill, again, storytelling. The key, one last comment, is how to tell that story in a simple way while retaining the precision and the focus that you need to not betray the science.
Do you have anything to add?
Just that it's something we really emphasize in the lab. I believe, and I tell my students, if you can't explain your ideas clearly to a sort of educated layperson, then you don't really understand them, and you're using language as a crutch to kind of work your way around the weak points. And I'll get to this later, but we actually have we call it an SCI community liaison. She attends our lab meetings, and so our gold standard is if Nancy is lost, it means you're not explaining it well enough, and you probably don't get it, so try again. So yeah, super emphasized.
So Murray, that's a great segue into the next question. And we have just a couple minutes to discuss this with our research panelists. Then we need to move to our consumer panelists. So Murray, you've talked about engagement in that you have an SCI community liaison who attends your lab meetings and participates in the lab work. Is there anything that you want to add about how you engage with the community in terms of your work? And again, we only have a couple minutes for all three panelists, so be brief.
All right, I'll make it quick. I'm going to throw down the gauntlet to the preclinical researchers in the crowd. There's something that you should be doing. A few labs are doing it, including mine. At your lab meetings periodically, there should be someone from the SCI community actively engaged in your lab meeting. It is to your benefit to do this, and I hope to make that argument, more elaborate later. Maybe my pitch would be this. My mom had a spinal cord injury. I'm actively engaged with various groups, and it's not enough. You need someone in the room to give you continual feedback on what you're doing, where you're headed, why you're headed in that direction, to keep you moving in the right direction. It's critical. If you're not doing it, you should be doing it, and there's resources available to find a really great fit. I'm not talking someone off the street. I'm talking someone who's been through a crash course on SCI, an invested, committed individual who's going to make your lab better and more attractive to trainees. So hit me up on email or later in the conversation about what I'm talking about. But if you're not doing that right now, ask yourself, why not? There, that was my pitch.
Gordon, do you have anything to add to that in terms of, well, it's not really add to, but again, briefly, what is the level of engagement? How has your lab engaged with people with spinal cord injury? And Vivian, I'm gonna also say that Vivian addressed this question. So Gordon, can you speak to that?
I can't say that we do what Murray does. The engagement that we have is more just knowing people. It's more happenstance. It's not formalized in that way. So I'm listening.
And Vivian, you did talk about engagement in your lab. Did you have anything briefly to add to that, or do you think you captured how your lab engages with individuals living with spinal cord injury?
Just one point, I like what Murray is saying and the practices that he's going through new funding from the Department of Defense. I think we're going to be even more compelled to do that, and at least on specific projects, but perhaps that will become practice where we have someone in the lab on a regular basis.
So I want to shift the focus now to our two panelists who are living with spinal cord injury, Jen and David. And my first question is, what I've heard from the other panelists is that really the communication follows the relationship. And although in this panel we kind of separated communication and engagement, is that necessary? Do you agree with the panelists from the labs when we say that really building the relationship and telling the story is how we communicate? Or would you have anything to add to that or change? So let's start with Jen.
Well, I think, I can't remember whether it was Murray or Vivian that said that, is that, embedding the lived experience into the research is fundamental. And we have to understand that this is not just spinal cord injury, that the patient engagement, consumer engagement, community engagement movement has been happening with research for quite some time. So if we look back, you mentioned Faster Cures, which was an organization created by the 21st Century Cures Act, as well as an organization called PCORI, are really developing and formalizing this community engagement with research. It's not that they're trying to create people that are living with conditions to become researchers, but working together as collaborators when it comes to making sure that we're asking the right research questions and solving the right problems, developing to those research states. And we're starting to see this even more, starting to embed into spinal cord injuries. So, for instance, NIH, we're now developing a Neurotech course, and it's developed on Neurotech, but we have a whole session actually early on in that course on patient engagement and consumer engagement and what that means, so we can start to teach students and early investigators how to embed that experience. The FDA has put out draft guidance on patient engagement and consumer advisors and what that means. So even our regulators are looking at that. And then even Vivian mentioned our funding agencies are starting to realize that embedding the consumer voice of the advocate can help bring out better research. So, excuse me, DoD SCRP program, the CI research program, has a requirement in there, and the PVA does as well. So I anticipate that funders will come along. So this whole community engagement movement is happening, and we should embrace it and try to formalize it as best we can.
Thank you, Jen. So David, do you agree that building the relationship and telling the story is how we should communicate, or do you have any reflections on, first of all, focusing on communication and how that might relate to engagement?
Yeah, I think when you're tapping into the larger spinal cord injury community that doesn't necessarily have as much knowledge in this area, I think probably telling the story is a bit of it, but also helping just to relate not only the progression of your research, but how it connects to other research in the past. I think every spinal cord injured person has heard since their injury that we're 5 years away from a complete cure. And after 10, 15 years, you realize that's, it's just sort of a pipe dream per se, but that doesn't mean there's a lot of exciting research going on. So understanding what the context of whether your research is clinical or preclinical, knowing what that means, what it might lead to, and just understand the excitement of that, even if it's not, a complete cure. Vivian's work on pressure sore or pressure relief sounds very exciting, and areas that are small steps that make your life a lot more enjoyable or tolerable, or small fixes. Understanding that would be a huge help. So yeah, just trying to communicate those things in a way that makes sense and help spinal cord injured persons selfishly know what's in it for them.
Actually, David, that's a great point. That came out of our survey for NASDAQ when we were getting ready for SCI 2020. Was we did ask the question about trying to hit the home run to cure spinal cord injury. Overwhelmingly, people said, "Listen, just give me an incremental improvement. I'll look to that to give me an incremental improvement instead of trying to always hit a home run." Right? That's how you move this body.
So the two of you have perfectly set this up for our next question, which was about, and really goes to both communication and engagement, which is, how do you feel the communication is through the media in terms of media hype? Does it, are there ways we can better communicate our work? Are there things that have been inspiring or disappointing that you have observed that could help inform this community at IOSCIRS about communication? And let's start with David.
That's challenging because the media will do with it what they want, and so you give your message and they cherry pick what's most hype worthy. So they feed on hype, and that's not going to be changed. But I think your community outreach is really important, because the more people that you talk with that can get the message out for you through word of mouth or passing along other internet resources to help teach people out there, I think that's important. Personally, I don't really know what the solution for the media is, but I think those other venues are probably a good way to get your message out.
Jen, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, it's funny. I had one of our comments this morning from our investor meeting, working with early stage companies that are translating technologies. It's always staying true to science, right? So always going back to the point of science. And I get you, David. Sometimes you can't control what the media does and what they take with it, but we can control the message that we send to them. So really looking at if it's early stage research or preclinical research that you're looking at, to really honing in on the point that this isn't a cure for spinal cord injury, it's a stepping stone to get there, and really push the fact that we're making strides to get to that point. But sometimes it comes out, we have to make sure we are very crafted in our message that gets sent out, that with one step that you're making in the research process, you're not all of a sudden curing spinal cord injury. Because, from the nonprofit organizations that we represent, all of our phones blow up, or social media blows up when there's, a new discovery that suddenly has been communicated out the wrong way, and it's like it's a cure for spinal cord injury, and we need to worry about it. So really to be able to craft our message that gets sent and to push hard on what we can do with the media.
Thank you. So David, I want to ask you this question. Have you been engaged in? I know you talked earlier when you introduced yourself that you don't have like Jen is very involved in consumer engagement and providing the tools for researchers to do that. And you mentioned that hasn't been a part of what you've done in that structured way. Have you been engaged in any way as a person living with spinal cord injury in spinal cord injury research? And if so, how? And if not, how would you like to see that happen? And I also want to bring it back to the focus of this group, which is on animal work. So the people, well, our panelists do animal and human work, but a lot of the people participating in IOSCIRS do animal work. So I guess the first part of the question is, have you been engaged in a research study as a consumer? And if so, how? And then secondly, would you want to be engaged at the level of animal research, and if so, how?
Mm-hmm. I think I mentioned early on, my family was fortunate to work with some fundraising for a few things related to spinal cord injuries, but specifically some research as well. And through that, we had some connections with some labs that we contributed to and got to learn a few things at that phase. That's sort of tapered off as the years have gone on, so I'm sort of out of that community at this time. I think from my perspective, the hardest part about that communication is making the connections with people in labs, because there's not, to the everyday commoner, a great way to just find out where to go to make those real personal connections in labs. So I would enjoy learning about those things with a scientific background, albeit not in neuroscience or biology or anything like that. I enjoy learning some of the specifics, the achievements that are being made. What was the second part of your question?
This group, IOSCIRS, is not all people who do animal research, but a lot of the attendees do participate in animal research. Their labs are involved at that level. How would you wish to engage at that stage of the research process? So people doing animal work.
I think again, although the accomplishments in animal research before clinical trials might not be that next stepping stone to a groundbreaking, life-changing achievement, but it still is very interesting for me to know what those accomplishments are and how they might relate to something in the future. And I think just because your work can be very specific and technical doesn't mean that some people might not enjoy engaging with those. So learning through seminars or personal tours or any sort of seminars you might do, either live or in person or online. I think we have a lot of great ways to get out to people now through technology, and I think that would be great.
That's a perfect segue to the next question, which is to the entire panel. And we have a few minutes for this question, but then we want to move into the chat with the people attending. So I want to ask every panelist, because we are hoping that IOSCIRS may prove as a unique opportunity to advance this area. So specifically, what could IOSCIRS do to really nurture communication and engagement? And I'd like to ask every panelist to address this. So let me start with Murray, who's on my lower right panel.
All right, 2 concrete suggestions. One would be consider reaching out to other fields that are out in front of us on this one, and maybe devote a day to just the question, how have you as a field, Duchenne's disease, for example, how have you as a field effectively partnered with people affected in a way that really helped your field? So we might get an example that way. The other is a little bit more radical. I mean, if the goal is to explain science to lay people, to come back to my central thesis, seems to me the best person to do that would be a lay person who had learned enough of the science to explain it. So maybe give the floor to some of these embedded people that are coming from labs. And this would be very scary for the PI, and many of them would balk at it. But if you want effective communication to the public, maybe you explain it to someone, and then they have to explain it to the public. Some things will be lost in translation, but I bet the audience will get a lot more from that than from me using all my jargon. Those are my 2 ideas.
Thank you. David. And I know you're less familiar with IOSCIRS, so it might be a little more difficult, but of what we said about IOSCIRS, how can we nurture this communication and engagement?
Right. Well, I think one of the first bits is being able to have people to make those connections with. And so I think trying to get a wider spread of IOSCIRS out there would be important. So maybe finding ways to communicate that IOSCIRS exist in places like rehab facilities and other spinal cord communities, because there are a lot of people out there that would love to learn about these things. They just don't know it's there. They just see the headlines and that's it. So I think being able to communicate that you're here is important. But then once you do that, seminars like this on a regular basis that are free and open for them to sit in on, I think is a great way to, again, make those connections. And then the more people that are able to see the research, make or see these seminars with researchers like you, I think you can engage with them more easily.
Let Jen.
Yeah. So one one suggestion is taking the research community that you have that are already engaging, and how are they doing it. But we can also learn from a lot of the other industries, as Murray alluded to. But one of the things that we're doing at the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium is, we run projects, and we've been working with academic institutions, research institutions, and even industry on designing consumer engagement or community engagement programs for them. And it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's really trying to understand what your program is and what we design around it. We also have an engagement database of about, I think it's around 90 people so far, that who are living with spinal cord injury or are caregivers or care partners, and have raised their hand saying, yes, I want to be involved in being a consumer advisor, so we can tap into that database. And David, we'd love to have you on in that database as well. One other thing that we're doing is we're designing a consumer engagement program. So those teaching modules should be, the first of those modules will be released later this year, which is working with the spinal cord injury community, those living with the condition, to train them on the research process so that they can speak the scientific language. But we also have one of the modules in there in terms of teaching researchers on how to engage. We also have some resources available on our website today. One of them, they're posted on our resources page, but one of them is specifically for researchers on where are the toolkits, how do you engage, how do you design a program, how do you connect with people, all of those kind of open questions, so that we can begin to engage the research community. And this is a platform where we can use this platform to be able to teach each other of what's already been done, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel in spinal cord injury.
Thank you, Jen. And that NASCIC, we have multiple resources for NASCIC that are listed on that research slide, which again will be posted. And there are a great deal of resources there. Gordon, so going back to the original question about what IOSCIRS can do.
I actually think that we've seen some things running by on the chat session here that answer multiple things that I've put. One is, how do you avoid the media hype? And someone said that, well, private foundations are a good outlet for that, with filtering that kind of information. Another thing that I can say is based on what came by here on the chat, but my experience many years ago at a Christopher Reeve Foundation meeting. It was before it was Christopher and Dana, and it was in Chicago. And what I remember is they brought in people living with spinal cord injury to kind of influence what was going on. And someone, and I believe it was Liz Bradbury, said that, well, we could run a session here that would be for those living with spinal cord injury, where the scientists could present in a way that's much more accessible. They'd have to learn, they'd get bidirectional information flow. I know at that meeting, several important things happened. One is there are certain things I will never forget from a few of the people that I spoke to that were living with spinal cord injury. Two is that as two former postdocs in the lab, now active researchers, at least Dave Fuller is, and Frank Golder and Jeff Reimer work on non-respiratory function. Third is that the individuals with living with spinal cord injury also gained a much better insight as to things that were happening and have a chance to feed back. I'd say that there ought to be a session on that. What do we want? And I've heard that. I'd make one more plea, and that is that the idea that you can target any clinical disorder, speaking now as someone who kind of likes to study the history of medical discovery, as opposed to spinal cord injury specifically. But if you look historically at the really difficult problems to resolve, for example, premature birth would kill up to 8 to 10% of the human population as they were born until the 50s, 60s, 70s. It was actually the 1970s that turned around. Following why, it wasn't the people that said, we're going to fix that problem. It was a little bit of blue sky. It actually came out of Army Chemical Warfare research labs, but the information, once it was transferred, became what I consider the biggest discovery in the history of pediatric medicine. I'd like to make sure that we keep that balance that says, yeah, we're watching out for new solutions for spinal cord injury. So I understand the frustration. If we're always swinging for the fence, we're going to strike out a lot, and that's frustrating, no question. We ought to be taking care of these things, these incremental advances that Jen was talking about, for example. Very important, I get that. And yet we don't want to give up on the other side either. Now, what can IOSCIRS do? We could probably put on a virtual session just like that, where it is designed really for those that are not in science, that live with spinal injury, that want to learn more. And I can tell you, I've listened to a lot of the young people involved in organizing this, and I think they'd be pretty enthusiastic about pulling together a pretty good program. I'd recommend 1 or 2 days, half days twice, rather than an ongoing seminar series. It's hard for people. And as somebody who's organized a lot of seminars, I notice people are resisting that. So those 2 half days might work really well. That can have impact on the whole field. I'll shut up.
Great. No, thank you, Gordon. Vivian, if you could respond quickly, because we are already going into the chat time. Great information, everybody. So Vivian, if you could respond to what IOSCIRS can do briefly, and then we'll move into questions in the chat.
Yeah, Linda, great suggestions have already been made. And my first thought was that we do need to have science for the layperson and have those. I'm not quite sure about the 2 half days, but I like seminars throughout the year that could be interspersed with the deep science seminars. And the idea is not just to have the special seminars for persons experiencing spinal cord injury. I think the scientists need to be there, and they need to be compelled to tell the story in a way that would allow persons with spinal cord injury or any layperson to understand. And I think they need to be, I think the persons with spinal cord injury need to hold us to the task and really push the scientists in, and be in their face and say, I don't understand what you just said. Can you please repeat that? So I think this needs to happen. I don't see seminars only for persons with spinal cord injury and seminars only for scientists, but I think that there should be interspersed seminars where you're doing the general science and answering the questions really driven by persons with spinal cord injury.
Wonderful. Thank you for that addition. So we're going to go into the chat. I just want to summarize a few things I've heard. I'm sure I'm not going to capture everything, but a few things I've heard are the importance of IOSCIRS in some format, having sessions that provide the opportunity for scientists and lay people to interact. I've heard that one opportunity is having a person living with spinal cord injury who's embedded in your lab or attends your lab meetings. And then in terms of communication, if a person with a layperson with spinal cord injury embedded in the lab, if that were the case, having them communicate the information in a way that's understandable to others. And I've also heard that It's really important that the field continues to work on incremental changes versus always cure, but that keeping cure in mind is important, and that it's important that our incremental changes or incremental advances in research are communicated. So with that, I will stop, and Bethany is going to pose questions or comments from the chat. Harvey Sihota has commented that just as researchers describe themselves as basic, translational, clinical, etc., aren't consumers also more heterogeneous in terms of background, expertise, level of interest, etc.? Does anyone from the panel want to comment on this comment by Harvey?
Yeah, I'll kick it off. It's spot on, Harvey. That's one thing that we've been trying to move away from is what we call tokenism. Is if you've talked to one person with spinal cord injury, you've talked with one person with spinal cord injury, to try to really look at panels or focus groups or larger community engagement, like what Vivian had mentioned before, so that you can get that diverse input from a wide array of people. So it's spot on. We try to avoid having, I have one person that we communicate all the time with. It's only one person's perspective. So yes, we are a diverse community, just like the research community is, or any other community.
Murray.
Yeah, so, I mean, absolutely. I mean, of course, the injury is just one part of a complicated person. I want to bring it back to this notion of bringing people into the lab, and specifically, so you should all do this. And what you're looking for are really two characteristics. One is a really high level of commitment, right? So the person that you invite in has to be willing to really dig in and do what they can to absorb the science. So for example, Nancy, our SCI liaison, one of the first things she did as we were getting to know each other was she asked for all the grants that were funding the lab, and could she read it? And then we had a conversation about it. And at that point I knew, okay, this is a contender. The other thing that you need is that person needs to be connected. They can't just be speaking for themselves. They need to be tapped into this amazing network that's developed of various organizations and individuals with spinal cord injury, so that they can bring to your lab not just their lived experience, which is great, but this broader perspective. So if they can check both of those boxes, you should consider. And if not, then keep looking till you find it.
Are there any other comments related to Harvey's comment, or shall we move on to the next? Okay, great. Bethany, next comment or question. So this is from Tracy Wheeler. Researchers provide unhyped progress through peer-reviewed publications. Is there a way to make these resources available and more lay-friendly?
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a really great point. And I'm wondering whether we can start compelling journals, and very few journals do this, where you can add a page or what have you, that is information that is now the exact same information that you have in your peer-reviewed publication, but now there is a summary that is a lay summary that reflects what you have in the peer-reviewed publication with no hype. Right, just basically taking what you are going to publish and put it in language that is going to be the lay abstract. So I think that's a start. That's a start. And if more and more journals do that, I think we will be able to start communicating the small but critical steps that happen along the way to the public and to the intended community of spinal cord injured individuals, who will now be able to understand what the media is making out of a story when they go to those really unhyped summaries of the peer-reviewed papers.
Thank you, Vivian. Others, do you have some comments or suggestions for response to Tracy's question?
I'm going to get myself in trouble here, but it's an interesting idea. I don't agree with the premise that peer-reviewed publications are unhyped. I think there's a lot of hype that powers academia, and the higher the journal, the more there is an element of hype. So I think we might have to clean our own house before we really get serious about that one.
I think there's a level of communication though too, to your point, Murray, and to what Vivian said, is that there's a way, we have to find a better way to communicate the what your findings are in very lay terms, and the other piece of it is distribution of that in an equitable way for those in the community to understand what you're doing. So again, it needs to be a two-way conversation, and I'm sure with the advent of social media or other platforms that we have today, maybe we can come up with something that can be a better dissemination from a lay perspective to the scientific advancement to a lay description.
I kind of reacted to what Murray said as well, and that hype and the complexity. I have trouble reading a lot of papers that are out there, and there is an intermediate for us, but I still think it's not quite far enough, and that's these brief review publications like in Trends in Neurosciences or Physiology, where they're well illustrated reviews for the scientific public. And it is certainly possible that there could be quite a niche for a next layer where people are actually trying to explain it more in the terms that Vivian, you were talking about, sort of the lay abstract concept, which, as you said, a lot of journals are beginning to try. But I think you could have a very brief review saying what are the highlights in progress in the field, trying to keep that unbiased, unhyped tone, but with enough encouragement to keep it interesting as well.
Thank you, everyone, for your comments.
Linda, may I add just one quick point? Media is always going to be, or media are always going to be hyping a story. There's no point in them, at least in their mind, telling a story where, okay, there was an incremental but critical move. They always want to hype the big story. And I think it's really our responsibility to bring it down to earth and communicate it in the most honest way possible. Of course, researchers are always excited about their work, but they really need to be able to temper that enthusiasm, even when communicating with the media and helping media understand what's critical. Because in the end, you need attention to get money. I mean, it's a vicious cycle, but you just have to be super honest with what your findings are.
But Vivian, I mean, I've had experience with media where they've taken things that were said and they kind of ignore that. They're not obligated to, right? So I really think that something that was intended, sponsored by, for example, a foundation or a society, somebody that wants to take ownership of that task and be a mediator that communicates in the ways that we've been talking about with the interested public.
Yeah, I mean, if agencies, funding agencies or what have you, become or charities, right, become the medium, right, where communication about scientific findings is made, I think that is actually a great suggestion. But you'd want the universities to give up their press releases and their own hype. I mean, it's a culture. It's a culture that needs to be managed.
Yeah, but going back to Murray's point is that there is a hype. There's this vicious cycle of of hyping to get funding, right? So how do we break that vicious cycle? And maybe that's where the funding agencies can come in and we can figure out how to all work together so that we can bring the level down to realistic findings rather than overhyping some of the messaging that gets out to the lay public.
So what I'm hearing from this part of the discussion is that we can't control the media, but we can control what we do, and that there might be an intermediate forum where we can communicate these results without the hype, to that is in a more contained way, that isn't through the main media stream. Bethany, what's our next question or discussion point? Great. So Cedric is asked, going back to incremental research, how can we convince funding agencies that this could be of the best interest for patients or individuals living with spinal cord injury? And I don't know, comments from the panel on how we can convince funding agencies, or is that something that people can comment on in the chat that represent funding agencies? Does anyone on the panel have a comment?
I mean, it's really in the hands of the reviewers, and this bi-directional communication that we've been talking about all along really has to change the culture in order to make that work. I think this kind of event right now is a step in that direction, but there need to be many before it will get there. And you do see it slowly happening, things that nobody cared about before when it came to funding decisions. For example, breathing. For example, bladder, for example, sexual function. They're now high on the list. People are recognizing, hey, we left that behind. And that's kind of an important step. So it does happen. It's just glacial sometimes.
But that's, to your point, Gordon, bladder and bowel didn't get to the top of the list until the preference papers came out, where they actually talked to the community and said, what are your priorities?
Yep.
And it wasn't walking, it was bladder and bowel and sexual function, hand function for quads. So again, that goes back to the discovery stage of when do we talk to people about their priorities of their disease state, what kind of outcome measures are you looking for, and that helps to drive your design controls for all of that preclinical work. So patient preferences or community preferences can help drive where research goes, and it can help drive where funding agencies.
Especially if it's well documented like that. I mean, that's kind of an important point, that it was out and people could look at it for years, I think. So, but that's a great point to make.
Yeah. And I think you know, funding agencies go by peer review. So the comments that are being made, and Gordon, your comment that we're judged by our peers. So our grants are judged by our peers. So it becomes a question of our culture, right? And we've been driven into doing what we're doing simply because there's less and less and less money. So the selection process is such that, you know, excellent grants no longer get funded. So, I mean, obviously it's a complicated issue, but since the peer reviewers are the drivers, maybe we need to start, you know, educating ourselves and our colleagues about the importance of incremental research. And of course, the applicant themselves need to explain the importance of this incremental discovery. So it's you know, it's a lot of work, but we have to do it, and you know, we need to think about what would be the best ways to do that.
I see Murray has been very patient.
Yeah. So right, to Cedric's point, it's true. The reviewers are your target, and you know where I'm going with this. Imagine you've got an SCI community liaison in your lab, and imagine they write a letter of support, and the letter of support, which is in your grant, says, you know, based on my lived experience and based on my extensive connections with the following organizations, I think that your research is going to make a big difference, right? The reviewer reads that, that's going to move the dial. So it's yet another reason why this two-way thing that I keep talking about, it can work for you in exactly this funding way.
And I think Jen might have a specific comment to that.
I do, but no, thank you, Murray, for bringing that up, because it's not just a letter of support, but I think we're starting to see a movement in the funding agencies that are including people with lived experience as reviewers. So they're giving a lay perspective of the review of the research that's coming through. So I know when I'm on the review panels, that means a lot to be able to say, what does this research mean to lived experience for people that are living with spinal cord injury, or how do we view it as an incremental step or an important step to improve function, whether it's at the acute stage or the chronic stage.
Yeah.
Jen, do you want to comment about NASCIC's opportunity for feedback on grants that are submitted in consumer engagement? I don't know if you spoke to that earlier.
Yes, so go ahead.
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about in terms of the grant turnaround, et cetera. Yeah.
Sure. So we have the way that the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium works is we operate via projects. So again, we work with research institutions and industry and really help to design the consumer engagement program wrapped around the research. So that's the broader engagement project. But we also understand that there are researchers that are looking, that are applying for grants and need some additional funding. So we actually have a very quick turnaround mechanism for letters of support, where they're looking for letters of support for their grant proposals. But we have a panel of project review committee of people with lived experience that review those within 3 business days, and we're able to turn it around pretty quickly. And part of the reason why we do that is because we want to understand what you're trying to achieve. We want to understand how you're going to engage the community if we do put our name forward. So really, we're almost helping the researchers and the research community start to think about what that consumer engagement needs to be before we can go ahead and put a letter of support out. So we have a very quick turnaround through our website. And again, we have resources on our page of when you start to think about community engagement, how do you go about doing that? So some of those resources are available.
Bethany, do we have more questions or comments from the chat? You're muted.
After a year of pandemic, you'd think we would all know how to unmute ourselves. I do apologize if anyone's in the chat that asked a question that we haven't gotten to. I've been trying to monitor it. I think for the most part, we have touched on everything that I see. I would say let's kind of give any last stragglers to kind of come in. And I know that we're past time now. So there's some really great, actually. Oh, another question just came through that I don't think we have time to get through. So I would say I will be happy to keep the typed chat going, the YouTube chat, but in the interest of respecting our panelists' time, we should probably wrap up. So it's the same for IOSCIRS. So we had a question about language. Thank you, John. So maybe there was a question about the best ways to, sorry, John, I see your question. I'm trying to find that in the chat. And we can finish up with this question as I find it, and then maybe thank again. We'll have this last question, let our panelists comment on it. Then my thanks to you all, and I won't come back in. Anyone who's available, I encourage you to spend some more time in the YouTube chat once we're done. This video will stay up in perpetuity. We'll be sharing the link, so no worries if you want to go back and re-listen to parts over and over again. So thank you again, everyone. I'll put this question up and make my exit, and look forward to many great continuing conversations.
So the question is, could we possibly, and this is from Catherine Madalena, could we possibly discuss inclusive and preferred language from people with spinal cord injury that researchers should use when writing within the research community as well to the public? Comments on this question?
I'll comment real quick because I have to jump off here soon, but thank you for the question, Catherine. Language does matter. And it's about working with the community to make sure you have the right language. So, I can't give you a whole definition or glossary, if you will. We do have a link to some translational language on our website at the researchers resource section. So I would encourage you to look at that, but understand that what maybe you think of translation and what a layperson might think of translation, it might be very different. So language does matter. And I think the more that we can be able to communicate openly like this, the more that we can address the language. But I will make one last comment about patients is remember we're people living with spinal cord injuries. So please keep the people first language. And we are not always patients when we're out of a hospital. We're people with lived experience or people living with spinal cord injury. So thank you for a great panel. I really enjoyed this, and thanks for the platform.
Thank you. I know Jen has to jump off, but if anyone else wants to comment on this before they jump off, that would be great. And if not, that's fine too.
Right
Thank
on,
you,
Jen. Yeah, excellent. Jen summarized it beautifully.
Great. So if there are no further comments, I just want to really thank the panel and the attention of the IOSCIRS attendees and keeping the questions coming through the chat. And I see this as the beginning of a conversation and not the end. And I think there's some there's some chores that the scientific community has in front of them to work on engagement with individuals living with spinal cord injuries. So I think we've got some chores ahead of us, and I greatly appreciate everyone's input. And as Bethany said, we can continue in the chat, but we'll let our panelists go back to their day jobs.
All right.
Thanks so
Thanks,
much.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Keep up the good work.